Good evening. I'm Roger Bagnall, the president of the American Philosophical Society, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this special gathering as we commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's farewell tour of America. The American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 for the purpose of promoting useful knowledge. While Franklin founded the society as the American answer to organizations like the Royal Society, it has always been international. When the Marquis de Lafayette was elected in 1781, he was, like many of the other APS members, a corresponding member, sending reports of scientific discoveries to the society and reading its publications. He would eventually visit the society 3 years later in 1784, giving a talk on mesmerism, or animal magnetism, which did not impress Benjamin Franklin, who was doing his own research to debunk the theory. By 1824, 40 years later, when Lafayette embarked on a 16-month grand tour through the United States, the society was much less critical and eager to greet him. APS Vice President Peter Stephen Duponceau wrote to the general saying, "While all the classes of our citizens are vying with each other to welcome the adopted son of Washington and of our country, the members of the American Philosophical Society seize with joy this happy opportunity to testify their respect for the generous warrior who first came to the aid of the cause of American freedom, and after so long a separation, to take their beloved associate once more affectionately by the hand." On October 1st, 1824, Lafayette accepted their invitation, and members of the American Philosophical Society held a special meeting in his honor, and that is the occasion we commemorate today. During his visit, he heard a speech entitled "On the Improvement of Government," delivered by Charles J. Ingersoll, which reflected on the 50-year period of rapid worldwide political change following the American Revolution. Lafayette knew this tumultuous era well, given his participation in both the American and the French revolutions. This talk was somewhat of a departure from a typical 18th or early 19th century topic at the APS. During the early days of the society, it was predominantly dedicated to scientific inquiry, and papers were more likely to concern agriculture or astronomy. But many members of the society saw a clear link between political liberty and the study of science. In Duponceau's letter, he writes of Lafayette, quote, "We not only venerate the hero and the patriot, but we also cherish the lover of science." As we embark on this celebration, let us honor Lafayette's spirit of inquiry. His visit to our society was not just a mere formality. It was a testament to the power of dialogue and the exchange of ideas, principles, and thought that remain at the heart of our mission today. So thank you for joining us in this celebration of Lafayette's enduring legacy. Bob Hauser, the Society's executive officer, will now introduce our speakers. Bob.
See if I can remember. Sorry. So, let me add my welcome to this most significant public program of the Society. It is, if I may say so, thrilling to join you in celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the APS, by the way, whether you have joined us here in Benjamin Franklin Hall, where we have a pretty good crowd, or have tuned in virtually. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, as as Roger said, the APS was founded by good old Ben in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which time he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like, the Constitution, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and other founding members for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we're also much aware of their faults, most significantly, their slaveholding. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of their legacies while working toward a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. That's the APS idea. Lafayette, by the way, was adamantly opposed to slavery. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing close to $2 million of research grants and fellowships each year, primarily to younger scholars and those in marginal appointments who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. The Society also sustains an informed citizenry. We do that through our meetings, publications, and exhibitions, influencing the influencers, and other outreach activities like this one. Tonight's program will be a conversation between Laura Auricchio and Michelle McDonald about Lafayette and the anniversary we're celebrating today, his visit to the APS. Laura Auricchio has been most recently Dean of Fordham College at Lincoln Center and Professor of Art History at Fordham University. But as of November 1st, she will be Vice President of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, of which I was once a beneficiary, so this is a big deal. She received her BA from Harvard College and her PhD at Columbia University. Dr. Auricchio joined Fordham in August 19 after spending 17 years at the New School in Greenwich Village, where she was Vice Provost for Curriculum and Learning. A specialist in the art and history of France and the United States in the Age of Revolution, Dr. Auricchio is the author of the books Adelaide Labille-Guiard, Artist in the Age of Revolution, published by the J. Paul Getty Museum in 2009, and at the back of the room, and you'll see right here, the Marquis, Lafayette Reconsidered, which won the 2015 American Library and Paris Book Award. She participated in the APS 2017 conference, The Age of Revolutions, and published her paper in the conference proceedings, Parade as Persuasion, Rethinking New York's Federal Procession. She is currently working with the Chateau de Versailles on the first ever exhibition dedicated to Labille-Guiard and serving on the Scientific Committee of France in the Americas. Michelle McDonald is librarian of the APS and director of the APS Library and Museum. Dr. McDonald joined the APS staff recently, just in January 2024. Previously, she was chair of the history program and professor of Atlantic history at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. In her 17 years at Stockton, she held several positions of responsibility, including interim provost, Chief Academic Officer of the Atlantic City Campus, Vice Provost, and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. Professor McDonald holds a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College, Annapolis, an MA in museum studies and American studies from George Washington University, and a BA in history from UCLA. Her book, Coffee Nation, say that fast 10 times, Coffee Nation, about 18th century coffee drinking practices, is currently in production at the University of Pennsylvania Press. So, please welcome Drs. Auricchio and McDonald. Thank you.
Okay. So, welcome to the American Philosophical Society.
Thank you.
And welcome to the American Philosophical Society. This is not your first time here, is that right?
This is my third visit to the American Philosophical Society, which I think we've discovered I seem to come and speak every 5 years or so, so I think I'm some kind of academic cicada was the conclusion that we reached.
Right. So if you enjoy this evening's program, look for her again in 2029. Hopefully not that long. So we invited Dr. Auricchio here to have a conversation about Lafayette, and I know that there are many people in the room who are familiar with him, with his history, with his military contributions, but not everyone necessarily knows as much about his backstory. So we thought that we would start well before October 1st, 1824. We thought we would start at the beginning. And so my first question is, how did you first become interested in studying Lafayette?
Well, thank you for asking. First, let me just express how grateful I am to be here. As you know, this is the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's triumphal tour of the United States, and I've gotten many, many, many invitations, and I have to say I have turned most of them down because I don't have enough hours in the day. But when Michelle reached out, I just had to say yes. So
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here. So I became interested in Lafayette, if you don't mind, through a complete and utter mistake.
Uh-oh.
Dear.
Jeremy, can we advance? There we go.
Thank you. So it was a complete and utter mistake. So as you heard, I'm an art historian, and my first book was about a woman named Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, and she was a French female artist in the age of the French Revolution. And there's a portrait at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., that is known as Portrait of the Marquise de Lafayette. It was presumed, it was purchased as a portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette's wife. Long story short, months and months of research, archives, physical research, conservation research, it's not her. However, in the process of doing all of that research, I became very interested in Lafayette's story. And I think that what really interested me the most, and the reason that I sort of had the temerity to write about it when there's been so much written, is that I realized that I actually was coming to Lafayette from a slightly different perspective than most American authors. Because most American authors who write about Lafayette know of him, of course, from the American perspective. But I actually first came to know him through the French perspective. And what we're going to see, and what you'll read in the book and what you hear tonight, is that those two perspectives tend to be quite divergent.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, so the next question then, taking it back a bit further into his life, is who was the Marquis? Most American understandings of him began with the revolutionary cause, but what was his background? Why did he become interested in North America's quest for freedom?
So thank you so much. So can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
There we go. Okay, so one of the first things that I just sort of want to explain about Lafayette is, this is what I mean when I say that most American historians who've come to the topic from an American perspective say, oh, well, he was a French nobleman. So therefore, he was from an extremely high society, fancy schmancy kind of
Knew
guy.
all of the cutlery down pat.
That's what you think when you think French nobleman from the 18th century, right? He was not that kind of French nobleman. So and what I'm showing you here this is a slide that's Paris in the north, and he, however, is from the Auvergne, which is in the south, in the sort of mid-south of France. It's about 300 miles south of Paris. And to give you, now that might not seem like a big deal, especially in the United States where some people probably commute 300 miles to work. That 300 miles meant everything. And one of the only way I can really give you a sense of what the Auvergne was like, or what it was perceived to be like, comes from, there was an English agronomist named Arthur Young, some of you might have heard of, and in 1789, he went to the Auvergne. And today the Auvergne is known for its sort of rustic charm, and also its lentils. It has very good lentils. But in 1789, there was less of a desire for the rustic, shall we say. So Clermont-Ferrand is the capital of the Auvergne. And Arthur Young went to Clermont-Ferrand, and he said, and I quote, "It forms one of the worst built, dirtiest, and most stinking places I have met with. There are many streets that can, for blackness, dirt, and ill scent, only be represented by narrow channels cut in a night dunghill." But wait, he's not done. "The contention of nauseous savors with which the air is impregnated when brisk mounted gales do not ventilate these excrementitious lanes made me envy the nerves of the good people, who, for what I know, may be happy in them." So, yes, it is true that Lafayette came from an ancient noble family. However, it was not from exactly the highest, most fashionable society. If we go to the next slide. So this is the chateau that he was born and raised in, Chavagnac. And again, to an American eye, it's sort of a fairy tale image, perhaps, of a sort of a fortified castle. And it is quite picturesque. I've been there. It's quite beautiful. It's quite lovely. However, Lafayette, when he grew up here, he grew up in, he was the only child of a family through a series of good marriages and early deaths. Ended up with a lot of money, but living here in the Auvergne. So as one did in those days, he was matched up, and he was sent off to Paris. And he was matched up with a daughter of another family who had great connections, but very little money, because they had many, many daughters. And they were very, very central at Versailles, very, very close to the royal family. So Lafayette went from here to there. And so, whereas he had been sort of the cream of the crop in the Auvergne, he remembered in his memoirs being surprised on his road to Paris, literally surprised that people did not doff their hats when they encountered him. But they did not. So he got to Versailles and was married into this very, very highly placed family, the Noailles family, very, very well placed. And when he got there, he was a terrible misfit. He did not know how to dance the quadrille. He apparently sat badly on his horse. There were all kinds of terrible things, such as sins that he had, such as these. And he was really quite quiet, taciturn, looking for something. He was raised on stories, of family stories, of fathers and grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers who had died in wars, one of which was his father, who died in the 7 Years' War, fighting against the British. And so he yearned for some kind of opportunity to establish a life of glory for himself. And he did not find the life of a courtier to be to his liking, nor did the court find it to their liking. So that they were agreed upon. And so when Lafayette first heard about the American cause, he was hardly the only French nobleman to be coming over here. France had actually already started surreptitiously helping the United States. But he was one who was rich enough, because remember, he was rich. He was rich enough to buy his own ship and come on his own. And he saw this as an opportunity to earn this glory and achieve some kind of life that he thought was worth living, that would live up to his ancestral aspirations.
So now we're reaching on one of these touchstone moments for Lafayette. So he really has been remembered, and we're going to get to the remembering and the commemoration a bit later in the conversation. But he really is remembered as this vanguard emissary who is bringing French assistance to the colonial cause, and presumably was welcomed with open arm?
Yeah, not so much.
Not so much.
So
Okay.
my favorite, actually, this is actually my favorite, one of my favorite quotes in the book is actually where, so Lafayette actually, so first of all, he arrives, it's a misbegotten adventure, and he arrives where he doesn't mean to arrive, but he does. He gets sort of washed up on the shores of South Carolina, and nobody around will speak French and speaks French, and so they go out to find somebody who speaks French. And this person wants nothing to do with a boatload of Frenchmen. He really wants nothing to do with them, because all of these Frenchmen have been coming to the United States to either in the spirit of making some money, or revenging themselves against the British from the 7 Years' War. But also, much more proximately, there had actually recently been a bit of a house cleaning in the French military. And so that people who had attained their ranks through purchase or inheritance were actually now being put out to pasture. And so a lot of those folks were kind of aimless and casting about. Meanwhile, the Americans were looking for help in any kind of way: guns, ships, know-how, engineers. So eventually, so when Lafayette gets here, George Washington is actually quite fed up with all the French. And this is actually a quote from Washington he's writing to Congress shortly before he first meets Lafayette, in which he says, "I take the liberty to ask you what Congress expects me I'm to do with the many foreigners, all of whom they've promoted to the ranks of officers." Washington is rather annoyed because Silas Deane has been over in Paris recruiting French officers. There are officers here already. But the Frenchmen come over and they think, well, no, we know what we're doing. These people are backwoods people. What do they know? And so they come in and they're expecting to be promoted and so forth, and they don't. Washington had more than enough of all of them. And then when he actually finally meets Lafayette, he actually, do you have another slide?
We do. Well, we have, I wanted to pause for a moment. This is one of the letters we have in the APS collections. And what I loved about this letter when we were thinking about what to show this afternoon is not only, Washington has so many reasons why he thinks this is a bad idea. These are people he thinks they have no allegiance to this nation. They have no personal affinity for the cause. Many of them are doing it out of revenge, and they don't even speak the language in which they're supposed to give and receive orders, right? So not exactly the meeting of international liberty, like-minded minds that we think of when we think of the American Revolution.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when they finally make it here, so then when Lafayette, or do we?
I don't have one for the State House, but I really do hope you'll tell that story when Lafayette arrives.
So Lafayette, through a series again of misbegotten accidents, he and his troop arrive in Philadelphia fairly bedraggled Their horses have all died on the way up. They've gotten dysentery. It's just, many of them have decided to go home already. They've had enough. But Lafayette is he is unfazed, and he's kind of like Candide. Lafayette is somebody who he seems to always see the best side of everything, and he's completely taken and completely swept up in the cause. So they get here, and they're very excited, and they're going to meet they're going to present themselves before Congress, and so they show up.
Just right across the street.
Yep, they show up right across the street. They show up, in fact, with Lafayette and 12 French officers gather in front of the Chestnut Street entrance to Independence Hall. So directly across the street. And they're hoping that they're going to have this wonderful conversation and be welcomed with open arms. However, instead, they are introduced to an American representative, James, is it Lovell or Lavelle? Do you happen to know?
I think it's Lavelle.
You think it's Lavelle? James Lavelle of Massachusetts, who gets introduced to them as, quote, a man who speaks very well and has been charged with dealing with all of your countrymen. So it is then one of Lafayette's countrymen then recalls later that Lavelle, quote, received us in the street, which is where he left us, after calling us, in very good French, adventurers. So they basically are saying, listen, we needed some engineers. We got the engineers. I don't know why the rest of you are all coming. Now please go away. And most of them did. Most of the men who Lafayette came over with left. But the next morning, apparently a letter from Ben Franklin had made its way to Congress. And it basically said, listen, this Lafayette guy, he's really well connected. Because remember, he had married into this family that was very close at Versailles. He's very well connected. All he wants is a little bit of glory. Just give him an opportunity. So Lafayette is the next morning, they come, mistakes were made, apologies are proffered, and Lafayette is welcomed, and he meets Washington.
He does. Now, this is part of the story, that this wonderful friendship that develops between them that apparently does, in fact,
Yes,
have
it
a
does.
kernel of truth, more than a kernel of truth. So the next slide we have is a page from Lafayette's memoirs. So these are written after the fact, but we do have a series of letters back and forth between the two gentlemen from the time period as well. And they are, especially those from Lafayette to
Yes.
Washington, absolutely filled with almost a joyous affection. I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah.
So if you want to take for the first bit, I'll take the last bit.
Okay, the first bit. Yes, so when Lafayette, they first caught sight of each other at City Tavern. And Lafayette...
Across a crowded room.
Yes, exactly. Right. And Lafayette describes it this way, that Washington was towering over everybody in the room because Washington was quite tall, and Lafayette was also quite tall. But he apparently sort of wore his tallness in a sort of awkward fashion, whereas Washington did not. And so Lafayette was immediately taken with him and says that he, when he first caught sight of the great man, he was surrounded by officers and citizens, and you could see what a great man he was, and that from this moment, a brilliant friendship was immediately founded.
And this seems to permeate all of his subsequent correspondence. So the letters, and candidly, I will say the letters to Lafayette from Washington are also quite friendly, perhaps not effusively friendly in the same way that Lafayette's letters are to Washington, and to others as well. But I just chose a brief excerpt. The longer letter is bound and published and is certainly available if you'd like to see it, also in our collection. There never was a friend, my dear General, so much, so tenderly loved as I love and respect you. And their relationship in many ways, and in many sources, seems to be described almost as a father and son.
Yes, exactly, because Lafayette had lost his father when Lafayette was very young, and Washington had no children of his own. And so this does seem to have been what actually emerged. But anybody here who might be a father or a parent of any variety might also know that sometimes you might get exasperated with your child. And what we see as we read through the the correspondence between Washington and Lafayette throughout the American Revolution. Washington is telling Lafayette, like, please do this, don't do that, no, don't mess this up, and then he does it. And Washington's like, I told you not to do that. But he's learning. Lafayette is learning. And again, I really want to emphasize this. He's somebody who was incredibly good-natured, incredibly earnest. And all of these things counted against him at the court of Versailles, too. I mean, just picture this. Picture somebody who's very honest, very transparent, very optimistic, and sees the best in everyone. They're not going to get along very well there. But this is part of what I think endeared him to Americans so much, because Americans really had had enough with the French already. But Lafayette seemed different. He didn't seem to have the same kind of airs that all of that the Americans perceived that many of the French did.
And he does genuinely contribute.
He does,
to the revolutionary
absolutely.
effort. He contributes his own talents, he contributes his finances, and he certainly works and advocates on behalf of the colonial cause to garner additional resources from France.
Absolutely. I mean, some of you have probably seen Hamilton, so you already know about the guns and ships. But that really was, when Lafayette. So first, he wanted to fight. He wanted this moment of glory, and Franklin had assured Congress that all he wanted was this one moment of glory. So it's the Battle of Brandywine, and it's September 11th of 1777, and they put Lafayette where they think nobody's going to come. They're expecting a sort of attack down here, and they put him all the way up there so that he'll be out of. Well, guess what? There's a sort of second, right? So anyway, bottom line is he gets shot. And he ends up being carried off the field with a musket wound to his leg. And apparently he's telling everybody, no, don't take me off. Keep. I've got to stay. But he can't. So they take him off, and he recuperates in Germantown. And he can't do anything but write. And so he does. So he says, all right, well, if I can't help the cause by fighting, I'm going to help the cause by writing. And he writes to everybody in France who can think of and says, the Americans are going to win any minute now. Don't believe it for a second that they're outnumbered. It's not true. They're going to win this. It's going to be great. And then he's writing simultaneously to folks in the United States saying, the French are all behind you. They've got your back. I mean, he basically willed this into existence on his own. Just through his sheer determination and optimistic spirit.
And those actions do not go unnoticed. And this is the role reversal portion of this evening's conversation, because when we were putting together the topics, I had as one of the questions, so Lafayette is elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1781. Why was he nominated for membership, and what do you think this signified? And Laura's response was, that's your bailiwick, not mine. So if you want to ask a question, I can try to answer it.
So why was Lafayette elected in 1781 to the American Philosophical Society?
It's such a good question. I'm so glad you asked. We have several glimmers as to why Lafayette was interesting as a potential member. I mean, he was definitely recognized for his military contributions. He definitely became well connected with the political elite in Philadelphia and beyond, who saw in him a kindred spirit who embraced not only the practical realities of revolution in terms of resources, but really embraced the ideology of the independence movement. And so for these reasons, in 1781, he was elected, or nominated rather, for membership. And what we have here is both the letter to Lafayette from the American Philosophical Society thanking him for his contributions to the revolutionary cause, as well as an excerpt from the minutes of that meeting on January 19th, 1781, where he was actually approved for a list of gentlemen in nomination who was approved then for membership. And you can see his name at the top of the list. But not everyone felt that way.
Yes. And so...
so we're going to shift gears just one more time, and we are going to leave time for questions, so we're moving a bit quicker now. But not everyone felt that way, particularly in his own country.
So in France, Lafayette... so again, I came to this question but to this whole topic with the question, how is it that Lafayette, who really did actually espouse very similar principles throughout his entire life, really stuck to this a very sort of moderate liberalism is probably the best way to call it. How is it that he could have been hated so much in France and loved so much in the United States? And the reason has to do with the French Revolution. So during the French Revolution, at the outbreak of the French Revolution, Lafayette was all in favor of reform. He fully believed the monarchy needed to be reformed. He adamantly believed that the monarchy could not be abolished in France. He thought that the French were not ready for self-governance. And he adhered to this middle path from beginning to end. And when the revolution started in 1789, it was imagined at first as a reform. People didn't realize that they were going to end up cutting off the king's head a couple years later. But it was imagined as a reform movement. So when it started, he was part of the liberal nobility who were supporting the reform of the French monarchy. However, that middle of the road grew narrower and narrower and narrower until he was very much alone, standing there in the middle of the road as the populations really diverged. So what we see here is a few examples of how Lafayette was seen in France at the time. So on the left, for example, is a caricature calling him the man of the people and the man of the court at the same time, because he was, on the one hand, he was supporting freedoms and liberties, and on the other hand, he was supporting the monarchy. And this sort of made him seem two-faced to some people. It was actually a consistent political ideology, but at the time, it seemed to many people, nobody could appreciate this moderate position. In the center is a joke. Madame Lafayette, Monsieur de Lafayette is like a candle that glows with the people, but then expires goes out in good company. So that And then my favorite though, and that really sums it up on the right, is a caricature that's called Lafayette treated as he deserves by the Democrats and the aristocrats. And it says at the bottom, you'll be hanged, famous general, and don't ask for any favors, any special treatment. But basically, the idea that both the Jacobins and the monarchists wanted to kill him, and it's literally true. It's literally true. We can come back to more of that.
I was going to move to the next image, which is that one.
Right. So this is partly how we got there. So in 1789, this is just a very quick primer on how Lafayette got himself into this mess. So in 1789, there was, on October 5th, 1789, there was a famous thing called the March to Versailles. This is apparently when Marie Antoinette was supposed to have said, "Let them eat cake." It's because there was starvation rampant in Paris, and a group of women started gathering. Fishwives, market women, sellers of all kinds of goods, couldn't feed their families, and they started to grab whatever weapons they could, makeshift weapons, stealing weapons. Then they started bringing their husbands and their brothers and their fathers and their sons. And eventually there was this enormous crowd demanding a march to Versailles, saying, we're going to go to Versailles, we're going to bring back the baker and his wife, meaning the king and the queen. Now, Lafayette at this time was riding high on his reputation as a disciple of Washington, and as somebody who was a figure of liberty. So he was embraced by the revolution, again, at the start. So he, in his capacity as the head of the National Guard, decided that, well, these people are going to Versailles, I'm going to accompany them in order to keep order. So the way he saw it was he was accompanying them to keep order. The way Marie Antoinette saw it was he brought a murderous mob to her doorstep. And they were both right. By the time Lafayette got there, they all got there. By the time Lafayette made it there, the heads of 2 bodyguards were making their way back to Paris. The bodies were not. And the crowd was demanding that the king and queen come back to Paris. So Lafayette assured the king and queen that they would be safe. And he escorted them back to Paris. And we all know what happened after that.
No, go ahead and share.
Well,
You can't just leave the punchline.
So all right. So he escorted them all back to Paris, where they lived in the Tuileries Palace, and they never emerged. You know, basically they emerged only to go to the guillotine. So Lafayette was at once their protector and their jailer, as they saw it. And if you go to the next slide, there was one particular place in Paris that really holds both a tragic and glorious significance for Lafayette. It's called the Champ de Mars, and it's where the Eiffel Tower is. And if you take one of those hop-on, hop-off bus tours of Paris, you might hear them describe the Champ de Mars as the place where Lafayette fired on the people. So the Champ de Mars in 1789, again, 1790, on the left-hand side, was the site of sort of the apotheosis of Lafayette in France. It was the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, and it was apparently the height. It seemed as though the revolution would be ended. There was a new constitution, and everything was now going to be wonderful. And this was a brilliant, beautiful day. Lafayette was the maître d', or the MC of the day. However, a year later, things had gone from this very sort of blissful, reformed constitutional monarchy. The king had tried to flee the country and had refused the Constitution, and things were going from bad to worse. And a year later, also on the Champ de Mars, because the king had attempted to flee, there was a crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars demanding that the monarchy be declared abolished because the king and queen had tried to flee. Again, Lafayette was the head of the National Guard. He came with the National Guard to try to keep order. One does not know what exactly happened. I've read all of the newspapers, and it's just like today. If you watch Fox News, this one thing happened. If you watch CNBC, something entirely different happened. That was what was happening in the French Revolution. And so according to some people, you know, one thing happened according to another. What we do know is that shots were fired by the National Guard, and some number of people were killed. Whether it was 9 or 60, we don't know. Whether it was started by people in the crowd, we don't know. But we do know that a number of people died, and it became known as the Massacre of the Champ de Mars. And Lafayette became known as the person who ordered his troops to fire on the people. We don't know that he did order his troops to fire, but that is the way that the story went.
But it's not where his story ends, and I'm mindful of time because I do want to give you some time for questions. So we're going to do a bit of a time jump again. This time we're leaving fraught France and returning to Philadelphia. So, in 1824, Lafayette returns to the United States as part of an extended triumphal tour. Philadelphia is one of his stops. It was his stop on October 1st. And we know this because we have the correspondence from the American Philosophical Society meeting when Benjamin Bond says we should have a proper celebration for General Lafayette. We also know that on October 1st, in 1824, he attended the meeting of the American Philosophical Society, and we know that because we have the stated meeting minutes, and we have everybody's name who was in attendance. For some reason, Lafayette's is 3 times larger than anyone else's. Why? We do not know, but we assume he was an august presence for the day. And we also know that the special lecture that was offered that evening on his behalf, again, on October 1st, in 1824, was a communication on the development of government here at the American Philosophical Society. And it really is an interesting treatise. We do have it again. It's available if you'd like to take a look. And the reason why we both thought it was so interesting was this was a treatise that was looking at the first 50 years of American development, North America's development, United States development, and really celebrating the first half century of the nation's progress.
Yeah, so Lafayette really ends up being, he was very young when he came here, he was 19. So he was one of the last living heroes of the revolution. So he became very much associated with the revolution. And so in celebrating Lafayette, the United States was celebrating itself in some ways, and its birth and its progress that it had made since its adolescence, when Lafayette was an adolescent. So just to quote one little portion of this text, it says that Lafayette was invited to revisit the scenes of his first eminence. The very idolatry of the welcome abounds with redeeming characteristics of self-government. So in other words, the folks were kind of congratulating themselves on how far they were coming and congratulating themselves for celebrating Lafayette. And it says, a squadron of steamboats brought him to the shore. A steamboat has been a vehicle of his pleasures, emblematic of the enterprise, mobility, abundance, comfort, and equality of the country which the last time our distinguished guest assisted at a meeting of this society was poor, in debt, feeble, and uncertain of its destiny. So in celebrating Lafayette, they were really celebrating the coming of age of the United States.
And I'm going to move through the next few slides quickly because you can come and see these objects on either side of the stage when the talk concludes. But there were a number of ways in which these moments were memorialized, physically, ceremonially, in all sorts of ways. There was not just the event, of course, at the American Philosophical Society, but there were days of parades before. And those of you in the audience who have been involved in the commemoration of Lafayette know that you did a valiant effort this last weekend to do so. Come rain or shine, mostly come rain. But this is just an ode to Lafayette that was actually, it was printed in the parade. There was a horse-drawn cart, and printers were printing these out as it was moving down the street and handing it out to members of the audience. There were badges that were produced, both the Ode to Lafayette and a copy of the badge, or an example of the badge, or in this case, that visitors to the event could wear to demonstrate that they were part of this celebration and take home as a commemoration. Or, if you had a little more disposable income, you could take home one of these. So on this case, we have both black jasper and blue jasper Wedgwood pieces bearing Lafayette's profile, as well as several memorial coins. Some are just of Lafayette, defender of liberty. Others have both, you can have your choice, a whole bevy of people to celebrate, Franklin and Washington, and then on the reverse is Lafayette. Or, on a more personal note, and we do need to move a little more quickly if we're going to give them time for questions, but we'll do this in the next couple of minutes. On a more personal note, I'd asked folks at the APS to digitize as many Lafayette-related materials as they could find, and this was one of our favorites. This is a letter written by Anne Haynes, who went to a social event in which she met Lafayette, and it sounds just so eerily familiar, honestly. She came home from the event and she said, "I will never wear this glove again." And she puts it aside, this touch, the hand of the general. "I will never wear this glove again." This is not her exact glove, but there are several of these gloves that were stamped and are in historical societies, you said, all over the country.
All around the country, because Lafayette went to every single state in the Union at that time. And so these types of events that you had here this weekend, they had in every single town, country, everywhere. And so on the right-hand side, and everybody who went to these things saved them. So on the right is another just example, is from the New York Historical Society, of just objects that somebody wore to one of these events, and she kept them.
She kept not only the glove, but also the hair device she was wearing, her fan, anything that was part of this event or this evening for her as a memorial. And then, but we did want to let you, not let you go. This is the second to last slide, I promise. Third to last. Not everyone, even the United States, really was a fan of Lafayette. This was a book that was written by Samuel Rush, who is a grandson of Benjamin Rush, and he was not on Team Lafayette. He's not on Team Lafayette. It's sort of an occasional day book where he's recording his thoughts about a variety of different things, but he really, really, I mean really, did not like Lafayette. I was going to give you one quote. I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I mean, it goes on for pages. It really does. He takes issue with his politics. He takes issues with how he feels he represents himself. He takes issues with what he thinks is his vanity, his popularity. Perhaps he really didn't like women who were keeping all of their gloves. I don't know. But it was quite the fate. But the last image we want to leave you with, though, is it's not just that the United States was commemorating Lafayette. Lafayette, in many ways, was also commemorating or Americanizing himself. He was very consciously crafting his image.
Thank you. So, Lafayette, as you've heard, he had a very tragic situation in France. The situation in the United States was entirely different, and it really was his formative years, and it was the time at which he felt the most loved, the most appreciated, and he actually put this in writing many times. My American reputation is very important to me. And after the French Revolution, he fled the country because they were actually calling for his head. The Jacobins would have executed him for being a monarchist. However, he fled the country and he got arrested by the Austrian government for being a revolutionary. So he spent a number of years in jail, a series of prisons in Austria. He comes back. And his wife's entire family has been executed. So they inherit a family property called La Grange. And Lafayette turns that property, or part of that property, into really what he literally calls an American museum. And he starts collecting objects, animals, artifacts, plants, you name it, alligators, from the United States. For his sort of American ground, he calls it. He calls it American ground. And this is his library. And what you can see in his library, if you look at the very top, there's medallions at the top, and there's 9 different medallions, and men who've been significant to him. 6 of them represent Frenchmen who were his allies in the revolution and who were executed. 1 for helping him escape. And the other 2 are Washington and Franklin. And these are the figures that loom the largest over his life. And he, to this day, his grave in Picpus Cemetery, which is the mass grave where his in-laws had all been buried when they were executed, has an American flag flying over it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us this evening. Please join me in thanking Laura. Dr. Auricchio. We do have time for a few questions. We have a microphone here. Why don't we go ahead and take the first, and then go ahead.
Was it the Jacobins or the Reformists who were responsible for images such as Rhétorique des Putains?
Wait, which one? The Des Putains?
The one with Marie Antoinette.
Oh, that is, sorry. I was trying to keep this G-rated.
We thought long and hard about which images, anti-Lafayette images we were going to show.
That I don't know, but I actually think it was, I don't know is the answer. That's the answer, is I don't know. Because when people publish these scurrilous pamphlets, they don't sign them. So I don't know, but I'll tell you why I do think I actually think it's a monarchist. I actually don't think it's a reformist. I actually think it's a monarchist because it's a very high quality image. So you can really tell a lot by the market for whom these things were intended. And so that's my best guess. But it also could have been like the Duc d'Orléans and his family, because they were great rivals. The Duc d'Orléans was a liberal member of the nobility who actually saw himself as so liberal that he renamed himself Philippe Égalité, Phil Equality. Yeah, well, it didn't stop him from getting guillotined anyway.
Okay, I think, go ahead in front, and then, yeah.
The fact that Lafayette's wife wasn't executed, does that mean that she was traveling with him?
No, that's a great question, thank you. She was arrested, but actually Gouverneur Morris interceded on her behalf. Americans interceded on her behalf. She was arrested along with her whole family, and Americans went to, there were a couple of different, it's a long story, it was as to who actually interceded. Lafayette hated Gouverneur Morris and refused to give him the credit, but I promise you he did. And he wrote to, he basically let it be known that the United States would not look kindly upon it if Lafayette's wife were to be executed. And so that's why she was not executed. Mm-hmm. But the rest of her family were.
Yeah. Richard had a question right here.
Thank you for this conversation. The space between 1781 and 1824 is interesting. How did Lafayette's reputation become so large in the United States? Who were the people who were pushing him? He has his detractors. I assume that he has his fans as well. And to have a kind of a nationwide celebration, he's in David Ramsey. He must be in other history books at the time. Who do you think was the guy who crafted this larger-than-life image of a character who was important, but not all that important?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's how my book starts, where I'm actually with a French curator and asking him to see some objects related to Lafayette, and he says, "Why are you Americans so obsessed with Lafayette?" He says, thousands of Frenchmen fought and died in the Revolution, and you're obsessed with Lafayette. I was like, oh, that's a good question. But Lafayette himself was actually pushing this. Lafayette himself was saying, so his assistance to the United States did not end with the Revolution. He became very active in helping to forge profitable or favorable trade policies between France and the United States. And he really became very, very interested, and he wanted credit for it. And he got really mad that John Adams got credit for it. He did. And he and Adams had a huge spat. But Lafayette literally was writing to people saying, like, can you please make sure that my name is in this book? It was really, really important to him. And he knew everybody, as you said. Mm-hmm. He got to know everybody. And so, there were the factions, of course, but it was something it's not an accident that he became so well known.
I want to make sure, okay, I'll do these two, and then we'll be out of.
I'll try it without the mic.
No.
There's people
online
online.
can't hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. The circumstance of the Frenchman coming here and not knowing English, do you have information on how good Lafayette's English was when he arrived, when he met Washington? How did they converse? I don't believe Washington had fluent French.
He didn't, and Lafayette did not have fluent English when he first got here either. So he really, he learned English largely while he was here. And his English improves dramatically, and you can actually see it in his writings. But yeah, when they first met, it was in stuttering English.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the talk. Just to give an example of self-promotion, this I read. When Lafayette was in Baltimore, he asked to see Poe, his grandfather, because he was involved with the quartermasters during the Revolution in Baltimore. And Edgar Allan Poe was dressed as a cadet in the procession. So a little tidbit as self-promotion.
All right. We have time for one more question. Just last one.
Great program. Thank you, ladies. What was Lafayette's relationship with Napoleon?
So that's part of the reason that Lafayette ended up living here, because basically he ended up brokering a deal. So he had been in exile, and he wanted to come to the United States. And this is another very little known fact. Washington would not give him a passport. This is 1799-ish, and he thought it was Lafayette was too hot of a commodity. Didn't want. But Lafayette was convinced he was coming here, and he was even going to come in a hot air balloon. Like he had a whole plan. But I'm so sorry, I distracted myself. Yes. So basically, his wife was very, very smart, Adrienne de Lafayette. She actually negotiated a deal with Napoleon to let Lafayette come back to the country, to France, as long as he stayed out of Paris. So that's how they ended up there. And to my mind, one of the most poignant moments is after Washington dies, Napoleon has a huge event honoring Washington in Paris. Does not invite Lafayette. So yeah, it was not good. Yeah.
Well, please join me again in thanking our speaker this evening. I'm going to borrow your book. For those of you who are interested in learning more, the Marquis Lafayette Reconsidered is available in the back of the room, and you're more than welcome to peruse a copy.
Thank you.